The last time we were together, we closed out the session talking about some manipulative statements that people make, like, if you don't marry me, my life is not worth living. If you really love me, you will prove it. John, if you put your nose to the grindstone, you will rise quickly in the company. Just do it for me, please. If you don't get some help, I'm leaving. This was a sample of some of the things that I've heard, and I'm sure Miss Carolyn has heard as well. I want to talk to you this evening about manipulative tactics. What are some methods people use to manipulate? Now, I gave you a list there, and I'm sure you're looking at that thinking, I didn't know I was going to learn Latin tonight. Well, you are to a certain extent, but I want to preface what we are going to do with the following statement here, okay? Manipulation is a deliberate form of logical persuasion. And that's very important for us to understand. It is a deliberate form of logical persuasion. It is not random. It is not haphazard. It is not a mindless, emotive expression. It is calculating, precise, deliberate, and at times aggressive. So if this is a deliberate choice of a human being, I can offer you two motivations on how this takes place. Number one, the person who is manipulating has seen someone else that they respect who has manipulated and gotten what they wanted. In counseling, that is called preconditioning. Preconditioning, something a person has seen and that person has received no consequences or avoided punishment, and so the person observing imitates it. Preconditioning. Now, I want to go ahead and talk to you about the different forms here. And the first probably 10 or so will all start out with argumentum ad. That's Latin for an argument that is endless. Ad means continuous, endless, without end. So these arguments here are going on. And the first one is Antiquitum. What this means is a fallacy of asserting that something is right or wrong simply because it is old. Antiquitum, you can see the word antique there, okay? It's an argument that says it's got to be right because it's been around all this time. So therefore, it must be correct. And sometimes you'll hear preachers kind of kid around, but unfortunately, there's an element of truth where the staunch pillars of the church, and bless them for being there and sticking things out, but they might say this in reference to a discussion about a new idea. And they will bring up how it was done in the past, and they might say, that's the way it's always been. Now, this is a little humor poked at Baptists because many times that's what they would say. We've always done it this way. Now, I'm going to give you examples. I'll try to give you examples on all of this, okay? And what came to my mind is that when somebody makes this statement, Dad always did it this way. Grandpa always did it this way. I believe that a lot of times it is the second generation of kids who are making that statement. second generation kids that are making the statement, it must be correct and good because we've always done it that way. And then you have Argumentumadvirakundium. That simply means appeal to force. That's what that Latin word means. Appeal to force. The arguer appeals to force or the threat of force to compel acceptance of the conclusion, or to compel someone to accept their position. It is a verbal beginning, but they threaten some type of force to make you comply with what they are saying. What I have seen in my counseling ministry over, oh my goodness, how long, Miss Carolyn? 25, maybe 30 years? I'm not quite sure. I see this with substance abusers. Substance abusers. They will threaten. They might not do physical harm, but they will yell, they will scream, they will threaten, I'm going to leave you or I'm going to kick you out of the house and you're going to be on the street. You've never worked a day in your life. That's an example of this appeal to force. Substance abusers can do this. And then you have Argumentum ad hominem. And this is going to have two approaches to it. The first one is abusive. The phrase literally translates as argument directed to the man. An argument directed to a man or to a person. The abusive person uses a variety of attacks on another person rather than talk about the person's argument or position. So here's a discussion taking place about a particular topic. One person has one concept, the other person has a different concept. We'll call them person A and B. So person B does not agree with what person A is saying. So instead of attacking person's A premises, what he's making his statements on, person B attacks the character of the person. It is a personal assault, character assassination. Now this word comes up again in a different forum, and it's circumstantial. In this case, one tries to convince the opponent to agree to the conclusion based on the opponent's circumstances. And Carl, you will appreciate this one as an example. A hunter may claim an anti-hunter must say hunting is acceptable since the anti-hunter is not a vegetarian. So here we have a hunter, here we have Carl, and here we have Rick. And we're discussing hunting. And I don't hunt. I've never shot an animal except for possums and snakes. I've never shot a deer, different things like that, okay? I would challenge Carl about his hunting and his pursuit of meat. Sometimes Carl sounds like a caveman. Must have meat. And so we're having this discussion that is taking place, okay? And he will pull this argument on me. Well, you go to the store and buy meat, don't you? Well, yeah. Well, somebody had to kill it and you're enjoying it, so it must be okay. That's an example of this argument. Another one is argumentum ad ignoration. In other words, ignorance. Argument from ignorance. The fallacy of this argument is illustrated by the fact, as an example, there must be ghosts, because no one has ever been able to prove there aren't any. And in some senses, this is a stupid argument from silence. But that's what this argument of ignorance comes from. It must be true because no one has disproved it. Now, this is what our liberal friends will use when it comes down to the Trinity. And if you have been tracking on the cults, this has come up once or twice. Well, the word Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible, therefore it can't be. I wrote a book and I addressed the arguments from the medical community, the psychological community, the religious community, the psychiatric community, who all gave an argument that masturbation is acceptable and harmless practice. And so I used biblical logic to debunk their arguments. And one of the things that many of them came up with, especially the religious community, the actual word is not used in the scriptures. And they're right. That word is not used in the scriptures. However, the word uncleanliness, unclean, incorporates, capsulize the concept of masturbation. They will also argue about the virgin birth. How could a young girl of 16, maybe 17, not knowing a man in a sexual way, bring forth a child? This is an argument from ignorance. Then you have argument ad misericordiam. In other words, the appeal to pity. The arguer appeals to pity when the conclusion is a matter of reason and not one of sentiment. Example, referring to a murder suspect's dependent family. We need to go easy on this person. He needs to do his time and get out and be able to reacclimate into the society and care for his family. That's appealing to pity. And you know what you hear many times if you listen to the news and you have these killings that take place, and in particular, probably the last 3 months or so, has been police officers with the African American community. And sometimes there has been a weapon involved, at other times there was a perception of a weapon, and at sometimes there was no weapon, they couldn't find anything. But you know what the family often said, not always, often said? Well, he was being treated for a mental illness, so that excuses his behavior. That is the argument of pity. We need to have pity on this person because he has a mental defect, a mental problem. And then you have the argument ad nauseam. You recognize the word nauseous. This is the incorrect belief that an assertion is more likely to be true the more often it is heard. Did you get that? It must be true. We're constantly hearing it. It's an argument ad nauseam. You get sick and tired of listening to it. And that is one that employs constant repetition in asserting something is true. Now, we have been assaulted with this argument through the media in many different areas. And then you have Argumentum Adnovitam. This is a fallacy of asserting that something is more correct simply because it is new or newer, novitem navis, okay? Something that is new or newer than something else, or that something is better because it is newer. This type of fallacy is the opposite of argumentum ad antiquitium fallacy. Because it's old, it must be true. This one says because it's newer, it must be true. And you know what? Advertising does this. If you watch any TV or you're on the internet or whatever, oftentimes you will see a product newer and better than the former product. It is 4 times more powerful in getting stains out of your clothes. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Probably 4 times more costly than what you were buying before. Newer does not mean it's better. Older does not mean that it's correct. And then you have Argumentum ad numerum. This is the fallacy that asserts that the more people who support or believe a proposition, then the more likely that that proposition is correct. It equates to mass support for its correction. If we were to take a poll and 10 people out of 12 said, we can't do this, they would be considered right. Their opinion would be considered right. It's called the majority rules. And beloved, in the Bible, if you take a look at the majority, they were always wrong in the Bible. The majority was never right. And I give you the example of the 12 spies in Numbers chapter 12 of Kadesh Barnea. God said, I've given you the land. Go see what I gave you. And for 40 days, they were overwhelmed with the bounty that God had prepared for them to take. But when they came back, 10 said, we can't do it. There are giants in the land. We are but grasshoppers. And they pointed to all of the circumstances. Did you get that? You become fearful when you look at circumstances. And it's a sin of doubt and disbelief when God says, I've given it to you already. And so, you know the story of Caleb and Joshua. They said, no, we can do it. Majority rules. By the way, you saw this at the trial of Jesus, did you not? The crowds standing out there. Pilate couldn't even find anything wrong with this man. No form of accusation. And yet the majority ruled when they cried out, we want Barabbas. And implied in that request, if you don't give them to us, we're going to report you to Rome, because this would have been the 3rd strike on Pilate, who had permitted 2 previous Jewish revolts. And of course, you have an example with Daniel, don't you? Who refused to pray to the king, and the majority went to the king and said, hey, you know, this guy that you like a lot, he's not complying with what's going on. Numbers can be powerful for good, or they can be powerful for bad. And then you have argumentum ad populum. That means popular. The attempt to win popular assent to a conclusion by arousing the emotions and enthusiasm of the multitude rather than appeal to the relevant facts. And I've already given you the example, but the mob with Jesus before Pilate, they stirred up the people. And then you have argumentum advirakundium. That means appeal to authority. You didn't know you were going to get all this Latin, did you? Next week, I'm going to ask you to spell some of this stuff, so you better bone up here, okay? Appeal to authority. This is especially The appeal to authority. Now, watch this. This is very, very important. Appeal to authority outside the field of that authority's experience. So we're going to point to somebody who's an authority in something, but it's unrelated to the topic at hand. And many times lawyers will do this on behalf of their client. They'll bring in the experts and they will give testimony about things that are unrelated to the charges. Now, in the field of the attorney's experience, this method of argument is in many cases perfectly legitimate for the reference to an admitted authority in the special field of the authority's competence may carry great weight and constitute relevant evidence. In other words, if I am an authority in DNA and there's a question about the DNA that was discovered at the crime scene, and the prosecuting attorney says, hey, it's the same DNA as that guy sitting over at the defense table, the prosecuting attorney will call in a gynecologist. No. The prosecuting attorney is going to call in an expert who is familiar with DNA to give testimony. It is a match. That is perfectly permissible. Perfectly permissible. It's a matter of position that carries the weight of authority. Although it does not prove the point, it can support the point. I'm thinking of an example. I hope maybe it would be helpful. Here we have a panel of experts. We have one from the field of archaeology. We have an apologist. We have a polemic. We have a theologian from a well-known Bible seminary. And we have a pastor of a very popular church. And there is discussion about the legitimacy of the star seen in the east by the wise men, that it actually moved, and the wise men followed it till it rested over the stable where, or rested over the house where Jesus and Mary and Joseph lived. Not a lot of those experts would have valid input into the conversation because they're not an expert in that field. They might talk a lot, might use a lot of words, might sound like they really know what they're talking about, but in reality, they don't have the information. Let me give you another example, maybe a little bit more practical. Many times I'm asked to, by students that I have taught in biblical counseling, they'll come across a new book and they'll say, you know, Dr. Rick, have you ever heard of this book? And what's your opinion about it? And maybe it's on childhood trauma. Maybe it's on sexual perversion. Maybe it's on spousal abuse. A lot of stuff coming out. You would not realize the volume of words that are printed on books and distributed every year. It is astounding. But anyways, they will ask me that. I don't have time to read every book that comes out of the market from quote unquote a Christian counselor. And so I will give them a little piece of advice. Go to the back cover and read the bio. What kind of credentials does he have? What schools did he go to? What degrees does he hold? And most of the time, that Christian counselor has a medical or a psychology degree. They've gone to a secular school and then transferred to, you know, a Christian school, they have earned their degree, and they do not have any theological training behind them. They know they have received training on how to counsel an adolescent, how to counsel a person who is addicted, and all of these counseling courses they have taken. If you look carefully, there is no theology that they have been exposed to. Now listen, counseling has a sure foundation when it is anchored to theology, not someone's interpretation through the glasses of psychology. This is an argument because of position. Now we talk about some words that we can probably say. Converse accident. What this means is hasty generalizations. Hasty generalizations. It goes like this: making a general rule based on a few atypical cases. Atypical, that means they're not the norm, they're an exception to the rule. For instance, considering the effect of alcohol only on those who indulge to excess, and concluding that liquor is harmful and should be outlawed. That's a generalization. It's an overgeneralization that takes place. And many times this overgeneralization, this converse accident, comes from what I call empirical data. Data that has been collected by studies, data that has been collected by personal interviews of those who have gone through the program, whatever it might be. It is subjective data. The reason I say it's empirical, because it's on the surface, and that data can change by just tweaking it with another study. And you witness this quite a bit on your news channels if they ever have a report on a health issue. They will come out and they will say, doctors believe, and you should listen very carefully to these studies. Listen to the words, okay? We believe, we think, it seems, it looks possible. There is nothing absolute about that. And so they'll come out and they'll say, we believe we can conclude that to improve your digestive system, a glass of wine will help that with no ill effects. Wow. Wow. Move over, cold duck. Now, for some of you Northeasterners up here, cold duck is a very popular cheap wine in Chicago, okay? And then a week later, oh, scientists have now concluded that drinking wine will give you cancer. Who are you supposed to believe? Who are you supposed to believe? This is the idea behind this concept here. And then you have dictode simpliciter. That's a tough one. And what that means is sweeping generalizations. Now, sweeping generalization occurs when a general rule is applied to a particular situation in which the features of that particular situation render the rule inapplicable. A sweeping generalization is the opposite of the hasty generalization. Let me provide an example. Miss Davis, are you still there? Miss Davis, are you still there? I guess she is.
You can't see me?
Well,
I'm here. You can't see me?
No, my screen is shrunken down. I just want to.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to tell you that what I'm about to say may be offensive to you, but you know my heart, okay?
Okay.
Okay. All blacks are drug addicts. All blacks are drug pushers. All Germans are Nazis. All Jews are cheap. That's a sweeping generalization. You understand? That's a sweeping generalization. So you better be very, very careful in our conversations. And then you have ignoratio enchi. What this means is an argument that is supposed to prove one's proposition, but succeeds only in proving a different one. Basically, it means pure and simple irrelevance. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody and boy, they are just going on and on and on. And about halfway through listening to them, you ask yourself, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China? How does this apply to what we're talking about? And if you know the person well enough, you might say, you know, Larry, thank you very much, but how does this apply to what we're talking about? That's this argument. They prove a different point. And then there's the straw man. This is the fallacy to misrepresent someone else's position. So here you have person A talking about person B and their position. And they do so they can set up a straw man, easily attacking that position, knocking it down, misrepresenting the position, and then drawing a conclusion that what that person believes is wrong. It is a fallacy because it fails to deal with the actual arguments that one has made. It's a sidetrack that oftentimes people get into. And in counseling, one of the things that we have to be aware of is this thing called association data. Association data. Let me explain that to you. Association data means that you are talking to someone, you're on point, you're presenting information for this person to consider, and they hear one word or maybe a couple of words, and they stop listening and they focus in on that one word or that phrase that you used, and off to the races they go to erect a straw man, set it on fire, and then try to humiliate you that you do not know what you're talking about. And then you have this one called 2QQ. Basically, this means two wrongs don't make a right. Two wrongs never add up to a right. You cannot right a wrong by applying yet another wrong. Such a fallacy is a misplaced appeal to consistency. It is a fallacy because it makes no attempt, again, to deal with the subject under discussion. Two wrongs don't make a right. And then you have equivocation. That means using the same word in two different senses, two different meanings. And this is where you have trouble in communication sometimes. Well, I thought you meant this by that word. By the time you get done with your 20-minute lively conversation, you realize you've been using the same word but with two different definitions. And you have to come to agree the topic calls for this definition. And then you have accent. This is stretching a word in a sentence, which thereby changes the meaning. Stressing a word in a sentence that changes the meaning of the sentence. An argument based on a change in meaning through emphasis or accent. For example, we should not speak ill of our friends. Unaccented may be a valid statement, but if you accent the last word, you imply that it may be acceptable to speak ill of others. We should not speak ill of our neighbors. Do you get it? Wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. Now, quoting or emphasizing something out of context can be a manipulative tactic. For example, the captain was sober today. What does that imply? That yesterday he was a drunk. Accent. Now, what I want you to do for next time, and I will give you a hint so you can do your assignment, is this. I want you to look for 5 biblical examples of manipulation in the Bible, and they will all be in the Old Testament. I've got 10 or 12. I'm only asking you to find 5. Old Testament. See if you can spot them. All righty. Okay, anybody have any wonderful thoughts from great readers?